Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Last week my mother called and, in that careful voice she uses when she wants something ugly to sound polite, told me not to come to Thanksgiving because this year, in her words, they only wanted high achievers at the table. And I remember standing there with the phone warm against my ear thinking that I could fight it and list the things I have done and the ways I have kept going when it would have been easier to fold, or I could do the thing I have learned the hard way, which is to stop auditioning for people who already decided I am not worth a seat, so I said that I understood, thanked her for letting me know, and hung up before she could add anything else that would linger in my head like a bad song. I would love to tell you I cried or screamed or threw something, because that would at least feel like forward motion, but instead I stood there in the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder. And I replayed a lifetime of tiny choices and offhand comments and those family jokes that always punch down. And it was ridiculous and a little pathetic that the sentence that kept looping was my father at some past holiday saying that Melissa had the drive and I had the feelings, and everyone laughed because apparently that was charming, and I laughed too because what else do you do when the punchline is you? And I only stopped laughing when I remembered the one fact no one at that perfect table knew, which is that the house Melissa lives in and the life she performs for everyone would not exist without my money arriving like clockwork, even when my own clock was running behind. Here is what I did not say to my mother while she sorted guests like she was running admissions for some club that never wanted me anyway. I did not say that 2 years ago, when Melissa called at some late hour using that voice that makes everything sound like an emergency wrapped in sweetness. I was the one who answered on the first ring, and I listened while she told me that she and Jason were behind on the mortgage, that the lender was calling, that the fees were stacking like bricks on her chest, and that she needed help just until Jason's promotion came through. And I said yes without asking for proof or a plan because that is who I have been in this family, the person who believes a promise and covers the gap. And the only boundary I set was the same one she offered before I even asked, which was that nobody needed to know, not our parents, not Jason, not even her friends who love to compare houses like they are trading cards. Month after month, I moved money I honestly could have used for my own life, and I did it without a speech and without attaching strings because I told myself that helping family quietly is not weakness, it is decency. And I even made little private deals with myself that I would treat it like a gym membership for my conscience, something I paid and did not overthink, and on the rare days when the debit hit and I felt a pinch, I would remember that Melissa had kids and a marriage she claimed was solid and a job she said was demanding, and if my contribution let them sleep without that heavy clock in their chest, then maybe it balanced out the years when I felt like the extra chair dragged into the dining room at the last minute. Useful, but not really part of the set. Do you know what is funny in a bitter, adult way? The kind of humor you have to chew before you can swallow. It is that while I was paying their lender and cutting back on the stuff no one applauds, like dental work and a new set of tires, Melissa kept the pageantry going. She sent pictures in the family chat of weekend getaways and countertops and a new coffee machine with settings I cannot pronounce, and she added little captions about how hard work pays off, and I let it slide because I told myself that dignity is quieter than pride, and because a part of me kept hoping that one day she would tell the truth, maybe not to everyone, but at least to me, that she knew what I had done and that it mattered. So when my mother said those words, when she shifted me from daughter to uninvited guest with a tone like she was moving a meeting on a calendar, the thing that surprised me most was not the insult, because I have collected those like coupons for years. It was the wave of calm that followed, a clarity I did not expect, and it sounded like this: if you are going to measure my worth by a scoreboard I did not agree to, then I am done subsidizing the team that keeps me on the bench, and if you want high achievers at the table, then by all means enjoy the centerpiece, but remove the foundation I laid under it and see what happens to the posture around the turkey. I know how this sounds, calculated and maybe petty, and I will not pretend I did not taste a little satisfaction when the idea landed, but it was not born out of cruelty. It was born out of the slow understanding that every time I let them decide the narrative, I helped build the cage I was stuck inside, and the only way out was not a speech or a scene. It was a simple act that required no permission and no argument. Just a click and a decision and the willingness to live with the aftershocks. I made tea I barely drank, opened my laptop, and logged into the account I had set up solely to funnel those payments, the one with a name I chose so it would never raise questions if anyone accidentally saw it on my statements. And I sat there with the cursor blinking like it was asking if I was sure, and I thought about Melissa's kids and about Jason's earnest face at holidays, and about my father's jokes and my mother's rankings, and about the way I have trained myself to accept the smallest seat and still say thank you, and I decided that the only person I was going to protect in that moment was me, because I have earned that, and because I wanted to see who they are without my quiet contributions smoothing their edges. I navigated to the recurring transfer screen, read the confirmation text the way you read something you have read 100 times without really seeing it, and I hovered for one last long second, not to build drama, but to acknowledge the end of a version of me that said yes out of habit, and then I clicked cancel, watched the green check appear, and closed the laptop with a calm that felt suspiciously like honesty, while my phone stayed face down on the counter, already starting to light up with Melissa's name, and I let it ring, because after years of holding up a wall no one admitted I built, I wanted to hear what happened when the first brick finally moved. People always think the big betrayals are loud and dramatic, but in my family, they prefer the kind that arrives sounding practical and reasonable. So when I tell you that the so-called golden era of my sister's perfect household was quietly financed by my boring little routines, I mean that for more than 2 years I was the ghost in the machine that made the lender stop calling, the escrow stay topped up, the insurance renew on time, and the homeowners association keep sending those friendly newsletters instead of late notices, and I did it with a set of automatic transfers that would have looked like background noise to anyone glancing at my statements, which is exactly how I wanted it, because if I was going to be invisible at the table, I might as well perfect the art of being invisible in the ledger too. It started ugly and human in a way that made it hard to say no, with Melissa whispering that the lender had given them a final warning and that they were one payment away from a letter no one wants to open. And she said Jason would be humiliated if anyone found out, and that she had the login to the mortgage portal, and could I please just help her reset everything so it looked like they had it under control. And I said yes, while pacing my tiny kitchen with the laptop open, and we built a plan. That would have sounded like responsible adulthood if you didn't know whose account was doing the heavy lifting, because we set the mortgage to pull from a bill pay account I created just for this purpose. We updated the contact email back to her so statements would land where they belonged, and then I set calendar reminders for property taxes, the annual homeowners policy premium, and that ridiculous quarterly fee the association charges for nothing more than permission to park in your own driveway. And as each date came around, I moved money like I was tuning an instrument, keeping the sound pleasant enough that the audience never had to think about the person in the wings. If you are wondering why I agreed to the secrecy, I wish I could give you a noble answer, but the truth is messier and more honest. Because part of me wanted to spare Jason the shame he would feel if he knew how close they were to losing the house, and part of me wanted to spare myself another round of parental commentary about how Melissa deserved nice things because she made good choices. And a small, tired part of me just wanted quiet, the kind of quiet where no one is crying on my phone after midnight while I stare at a spreadsheet trying to see a path out that doesn't involve me bleeding slowly into someone else's balance sheet. During those years, small incidents kept stacking in ways I pretended not to notice, like the afternoon my mother sent a message praising Melissa for being so grown up about money because she prepaid something or other. And I smiled at my screen in that way you smile at a person you do not trust, and I swallowed a response, because I have learned that telling the truth to people who are allergic to it only causes hives, and I chose the path of least noise, which, as it turns out, is the quickest road to resentment when you are the only one paying tolls. So when I canceled the core transfer after that Thanksgiving call, I did not stop there, because if I was going to step away from the machine I had built, I needed to power it down fully, not leave it humming in the corner waiting to pull from me out of habit. And I went into the tax portal and removed my payment method for their parcel. I opened the insurance account I had quietly funded last year when they forgot that annual premium, and I shifted the renewal back to Melissa's card, and I deleted the stupid recurring payment to the association that I had nicknamed in my bank as peacekeeping, which in hindsight felt like the saddest joke I have ever written, and then I sat with the stillness that followed. The kind that makes you hear your own rationalizations walking out the door. I wish I could say I felt nothing but righteous satisfaction, but what I felt was layered and complicated, because while I was absolutely done auditioning for a family that claps for the wrong performances, I also knew there were kids asleep in that house and a husband who believed the story he had been told about a stable life, and I had to live with the fact that my decision would expose more than just a balance error. It would expose a hierarchy of truth inside our family where appearance outranks honesty every time, and I decided I could live with that exposure because I did not cause it. I only stopped funding its costume changes. It did not take long for the reality to start knocking, first as a soft ping in the shared family chat where Melissa posted a cheerful note about tightening up before the holiday season, like she was leading some productivity challenge. Then as a private text asking whether my bank had changed something with bill pay because a payment seems delayed, and I stared at the message and considered explaining, considered delivering a neat little summary that would let her save face while correcting course, but then I remembered the sentence about high achievers at the table and the way my mother's voice sharpened at the edges when she said it. And I decided that none of them had earned an explanation delivered in a tone that made their lives simpler at the expense of my boundaries. Instead, I replied with a line that sounded polite and useless, something like I haven't changed anything on my side, which was technically true because by then there was no my side left in her payment chain, and after I hit send I went one step further. The step I had debated even before the phone call, and I enabled transaction alerts on the mortgage account using the login Melissa gave me back when everything was burning, not to manipulate anything, not to lock her out or create chaos, but to make sure that any coming notice of a returned payment or a demand for arrears would go to her phone and not mine, because information should live with the person responsible for acting on it. And I was done being the emergency contact for people who do not put my name on the guest list unless they need a firefighter. Thanksgiving came and went with staged photos and captions about gratitude that read like they were workshopped for approval, and I cooked something small for myself and did not post anything at all, and I thought maybe the storm would pass quietly. Maybe they would find a way to fix it without me, but 3 days later the first serious alert hit, a very specific message about an automatic draft being returned for insufficient funds and a request to contact the lender within a certain window to avoid additional fees, and before I even finished reading it my screen lit up with Melissa's name followed by a second line I had never seen before, Jason's number calling right after. And I let both go to voicemail while I opened a fresh note and began writing down dates, amounts, and every step I had taken, not to justify myself to them, but to prepare for the moment I knew was coming when someone would finally ask who had been carrying the weight and why the floor started shaking the second I decided to put it down. When the first transfer failed and the lender sent that prim little message asking for immediate attention, I told myself to keep breathing and to let the problem sit exactly where it belonged, which was not in my lap anymore. And I left my phone face down like it was some noisy neighbor I refused to invite in, because I knew that if I picked up on the first ring I would slide back into the role they wrote for me without my consent, the role where I apologize for making other people uncomfortable by not rescuing them fast enough, and I had promised myself that this time I would watch the story unfold without editing it to protect the actors who love their close-ups. Melissa tried soft first, because she always does, and it arrived as a breezy text about how banking systems are such a mess, and how sometimes bill pay hiccups, and how she knew I had a good relationship with my bank and could I, if it was not a big deal, check whether a setting changed, and I read it twice, not because I was confused, but because I could feel my old training tugging at me to make her day easier, and then I wrote back in a calm tone that I had not changed anything and that I hoped she could resolve it directly with her lender, which was a true sentence that felt like a small act of rebellion, and after I sent it I put the phone down again and stood in the kind of silence that used to scare me, a silence that now felt like a clean room in my head where I could hear myself think. A cousin called that afternoon, the one who collects family news like it is a competitive sport. And she was pretending to ask how my week was while obviously trying to see whether I had heard that Melissa was offloading their second car because it made more sense for the environment or some other news story about being responsible. And I hummed and let her talk, and I did not give her anything, because the lesson I have learned the hard way is that you do not feed people who show up hungry for gossip and leave full of your pain. And when we hung up, I realized that what I felt most was not triumph, but a kind of relief that the narrative was finally out of my control. That whatever they chose to say would have to be managed without me writing the checks that made their performance look seamless. Thanksgiving landed exactly the way I expected it would, which is to say with glossy photos and a caption about gratitude that sounded like it was composed to impress someone who once told them that authenticity matters on social media. And I looked at the image without zooming in, and then I put my phone away and made myself a plate and watched a show that required nothing from me, and when the day ended I slept without that weird guilt hangover I used to carry after every family event. The one that comes from laughing at jokes that aim at your ribs while telling yourself it is not worth making a scene. And I woke up the next morning with a strange lightness, like I had finally exited a room that always smelled faintly of judgment. 2 days later the lender escalated, because that is what lenders do, and the alert spelled out what Melissa must have already known. That the missed draft triggered a fee and that failure to make good within a short window would push the account into a status that is just a polite way of saying the clock starts ticking louder, and minutes after that message hit, my phone lit up with calls that stacked on top of each other so quickly that I watched the names shuffle like a deck of cards first. Melissa, then Jason, then our mother, then my father, all trying to reach me with the urgency that appears only when the consequences arrive. And I let it all roll to voicemail while I poured coffee and sat down with a notebook to write a clear list of what I had done and when, not for them, not even for some future fight, but for myself, because I needed a record that I had acted cleanly, that I had not sabotaged anything, that I had simply withdrawn support from a structure that insisted it did not need me. Jason's message surprised me only in tone, because he sounded polite and careful in a way that told me he did not yet know the full story and was trying to be the reasonable adult in the room. Asking whether I had any insight into a billing issue on a shared account and whether there had been some misunderstanding that we could clear up quickly. And I sat there with my thumb hovering over the reply button thinking about all the times I had run interference to protect his pride and how doing that had become one more way I kept everyone comfortable at my own expense. And I wrote back a single long sentence that said I was not a participant in their household finances and that anything to do with their mortgage should be directed to the person who manages it, which was as close as I could get to telling the truth without blowing a fuse. And after I sent it, I turned my phone to silent again because I could feel the next wave coming. The family chat turned suddenly lively with my mother posting a vague reminder about the importance of communication, and my father dropping a remark about how crises are simpler when everyone pulls together, which would have been funny if it were not so exhausting. Because what they meant by everyone was me, and by pulling together they meant restoring a system that benefited them while erasing the cost to me, and I watched the bubbles appear and disappear, and I did not engage, because sometimes the most grown-up thing you can do is not perform maturity for people who confuse silence with agreement. By late afternoon, Melissa switched strategies and left a voicemail without the sugar. Her voice tight and frantic as she said she did not know what I had done to the accounts, but I needed to put it back the way it was because the lender was threatening fees and Jason was starting to ask questions she could not answer, and I listened to the message twice. Not because I enjoyed it, but because it was the first time in years that she spoke to me without the performative gloss, and there was a tiny, ugly satisfaction in hearing what the truth sounds like when it finally squeezes through the cracks. I spent the evening cleaning out old emails and unsubscribing from newsletters I do not read and making small practical moves that felt like aligning my life with the version of myself I keep saying I want to be, and just when I thought the day would end quietly, my phone buzzed with a different kind of alert, a formal notice in careful language about a required payment of multiple missed drafts due within a short grace period and an invitation to contact the loss mitigation department to discuss options, and before I could even process it, another call came through, not from Melissa this time, but from a number I recognized immediately, which made my stomach tighten in that familiar way that dates back to childhood dinners and ranking games. And I stared at the screen while it rang and thought, here we go, because when my father calls with that number, it means the family has decided there must be a villain, and they have already picked the name, and as I slid my finger across, 2. Answer, I realized that for the first time in my life I was not walking into their courtroom as a defendant begging for leniency, but as a witness who finally brought the ledger. And I said hello and waited to see whether he wanted the truth or just someone to blame. My father opened with that dry authority he saves for moments when the family story needs a narrator, saying that there had been some confusion with Melissa's mortgage and that it would be better for everyone if I could just straighten out whatever I had adjusted. Because the lender was overreacting and the holidays were not the time for drama, and I listened with the kind of quiet that used to make me feel small, but now felt like a choice, and when he paused for my cooperation the way he always does, I told him, in a voice I barely recognized as mine because it was calm and even, that I had not adjusted their accounts. I had simply stopped paying bills that were never mine to begin with. And that if there was confusion, it was only because the version of reality they prefer is finally bumping into the kind with invoices and due dates. He did not like that, because he shifted immediately into history and duty and the way families should pull together when someone stumbles. And I let him run the film until he got to the part where he said that Melissa had always carried herself with pride and responsibility, and that she must be under unusual stress. And it would mean a lot if I could be the bigger person for a few months while they got things stabilized, and I felt the familiar tug toward the old script, the one where I apologize for boundaries and send a transfer to make the noise stop, but the new part of me that I have been building in silence just replied that being the bigger person does not mean being the bank, and that if Melissa is so responsible, then she can be responsible for telling the truth in her house and in ours. He tried a softer angle then, asking if there was some misunderstanding between the two of us that had led to me taking this step, and he even said step like he was giving me credit for strategic thinking instead of calling me vindictive. And I told him the only misunderstanding that had lived in our family for years was the one where everyone pretended I had less value while taking the value I created, and that I was done playing that role, and he went quiet, the kind of quiet that in childhood meant a lecture was coming, and then my mother's voice slipped in from the background because of course she was on speaker, saying that she was disappointed that I would choose this moment to make a point when children were involved and holiday plans were set. And I said that I did not choose the moment chose me when they told me I was not welcome because they only wanted high achievers at the table, and that if they were comfortable ranking people by optics, they should be comfortable living with the fine print on those optics once the invisible sponsor steps away. The call turned into the kind of messy group effort that never solves anything, with my mother pushing for a temporary fix and my father hinting that there would be consequences for my relationship with the family if I insisted on making things hard. And I kept repeating a single principle, not because I wanted to be stubborn, but because I needed to hear myself say it out loud, which was that I would not be resuming any financial involvement with Melissa's household now or later, and if there was a path out of this for them, it would have to begin with honesty between spouses and then, if they wanted, honesty with the rest of us. And at that my father said something clipped about how bringing Jason into this would humiliate Melissa and destabilize the family, and I said that the family was already destabilized. We had just been using my money like duct tape to keep the frame from rattling. They finally ran out of scripts and the call ended with that brittle truce where no one says goodbye with warmth, and I put the phone down and walked around my apartment replaying their words and mine, not to doubt myself, but to check whether I had crossed into cruelty. And the verdict I landed on was simple, which is that it is not cruelty to stop lying, and it is not cruelty to let adults carry the truth that belongs to them, and once that sentence settled I knew exactly what I needed to do next, not out of revenge dressed as righteousness, but out of respect for reality, because this situation could not move forward until the person who shares the mortgage also shares the facts. So I drafted one message that I knew would break the seal without detonating the room, and I sent it to Jason directly with no flourish and no editorializing. Just a single long line that said I am stepping back from a private financial arrangement that has been in place for more than 2 years to keep your household's mortgage current. And any questions about what that entailed should be discussed with your wife, because it is her story to tell, and I attached one screenshot that showed a long column of payments hitting the lender from an account in my name with identifying numbers cropped, not to shame him or to turn this into a public trial, but to put a hard shape around a truth he had the right to know. And the second I hit send, I felt that complicated wash of relief and dread you only get when you finally choose clarity over peace. Within minutes, he wrote back with a string of questions that climbed quickly from cautious to panicked, asking whether this was a mistake and why on earth I had been involved and whether Melissa had asked me to do this, and whether I understood what position this put him in at work and with the kids and with the lender, and I took a breath and replied that I understood he was shocked, that I was not going to litigate the past in text, that I would be willing to answer basic questions if Melissa was present, and that beyond that I would not be participating in any conversation that tried to make me the architect of their problem, and I put the phone down again and let the noise rise without touching it. Because you can love people and still refuse to be their cushion when they jump from stories they built on illusions. My parents tried me again that evening, switching to guilt and legacy and the idea that every family has secrets for a reason, and I told them calmly that secrets are not legacy, they are rot, and that my only condition going forward was simple enough for anyone to understand, which is that I would not be erased in one breath and exploited in the next, and that if anyone wanted to speak to me about forgiveness, they needed to use words like acknowledgement and apology first, and we ended the call with my mother saying she hoped I was proud of myself and me saying that pride had nothing to do with it. This was about alignment, and then I did the quietest, pettiest, most necessary thing, which was to scroll back through 2 years of family chat threads and mark every little credit they had handed Melissa for being organized and disciplined, and I archived the lot like closing the lid on a box I had kept open out of habit. The small act of revenge I chose that night was not loud or cruel or cinematic, but it was precise, because I forwarded my single message to Jason into our family chat without the screenshot. Just the text that said I was stepping back from a private arrangement and that any questions belonged in a conversation between spouses, and I did it without commentary and without adding a single adjective, and the typing bubbles lit up like fireworks, and then went still, and my phone started vibrating across the table with Melissa's name over and over, and I stared at it until the screen went black, and then it lit again from an unknown number that I recognized as the lender's regional office. And I answered with a steady voice and said I could not discuss any account because I was not the borrower, and the agent paused, apologized, and thanked me for my time, and as I hung up, Jason's name replaced the missed calls with a new message that said he was on his way and we were going to talk this through right now, which would have sounded like a threat a year ago, but tonight it sounded like the truth finally walking to my door, and I stood there with my hand on the knob thinking that when it opens I am done protecting anyone from the consequences of my absence. Jason showed up fast in that way a person does when their version of stability has been yanked by a cord they never saw, and he stood in my doorway with that careful politeness that men use when they are trying not to start a fight they know they might lose. And he asked if we could sit because he wanted to understand what on earth had been happening, and I let him in and poured water we did not drink, and I told him, without heat and without softness, that for more than 2 years I had covered the monthly mortgage and the stray costs that attach themselves to homeownership like barnacles, that Melissa had asked me to keep it private because she did not want anyone thinking less of them, and that I went along because I thought I was buying peace for everyone. And I explained that after being told I was not welcome at Thanksgiving because I did not qualify as a high achiever, I did the simplest and most honest thing I have done in a long time, which was to stop paying other people's bills and to let the truth sit with the people who owed it. He started with disbelief, the kind that sounds like questions, but is really the noise you make when the ground shifts under your shoes. And then his questions turned into something quieter as I opened my laptop and showed him the outgoing transfers and the dates and the confirmation emails and the insurance renewal I had covered last year because Melissa forgot. And I watched his face move from confusion to understanding to something like embarrassment, and when he finally spoke he said he needed to talk to his wife and that he could not understand why she would keep something this big from him, and I told him that I could understand it perfectly well because she has always been rewarded in this family for looking composed. and that my mistake was thinking I could help her keep that look without turning myself into the scaffolding, and he nodded slowly and asked what I was going to do now that the lender was threatening fees and deadlines, and I said the words I had rehearsed in my head for days, which were that I was done funding a story that erased me, and that if they wanted a path out of immediate disaster, the first step would have to be truth. We were still in the living room when Melissa arrived without knocking, moving like someone who believed urgency was the same thing as permission, and she went straight to the point with a voice that had lost all of its sugar, saying that I had humiliated her by involving Jason and that I had created a mess that would follow her children, and I told her that I had not created anything. I had just stopped cleaning up what she left behind, and that if the mess was following her it was because the truth finally had her address, and she started to cry in that way that used to unravel me, listing the lender's dates and the penalties and the holiday plans and the nightmare of moving, and for a moment I felt the old muscle memory flare up, the one that reaches for my wallet to stop the noise, and then I remembered the phone call where my mother told me I was not welcome, and I remembered every time Melissa posted a photo about hard work paying off, and I let the urge pass like a wave that does not get to drag me out to sea anymore. I told them both that I would put one and only one offer on the table, and that it had a short shelf life because the lender's timeline was not a suggestion. And I said that if they wanted me to consider a single bridge payment to stop the immediate penalties while they reorganized, the price would not be interest or collateral or some legal instrument. The price would be honesty. And it would be due in full before I moved a cent, and I laid it out in plain, unadorned language that even the most spin-happy person in our family could not twist, saying that Melissa would need to tell Jason the entire truth with dates and amounts and the role she asked me to play. That both of them would need to post a message in the family chat acknowledging that for more than 2 years I had kept their mortgage current and that I was excluded from Thanksgiving anyway, and that my parents would need to send a separate message, rescinding the ridiculous high achiever rule and apologizing for the disrespect, and I added that if any of those steps were skipped or softened or outsourced to euphemisms, then my involvement would end that second, because I am not interested in saving faces anymore, I am interested in saving my spine. Jason said that the conditions were harsh, and I said that the conditions were educational, and that if they wanted to teach everyone to applaud the right things for once, this was the lesson. And he rubbed his hands over his face the way tired men do and said he could agree to it, and he looked at Melissa for her answer, and she could not bring herself to say the words because the thing she worships most is the idea that she is the competent one. And I watched the war in her eyes between survival and image, and in the end she picked image, which is what she has always picked, because she said she would rather take a hit than kneel in front of our parents' pride, and that is when the last sliver of doubt I had about my decision finally vanished. Because you cannot help people whose first loyalty is to a performance. I told them, calmly, that there would be no bridge payment, no emergency transfer, no quiet fix that let everyone keep pretending. And I added that I had already contacted the lender's customer service to remove my information from every notification and that I had documented, for my own records, the precise scope of my past support. Not because I planned to use it as a weapon, but because I refused to let anyone retroactively paint me as the arsonist in a fire I had been putting out for years. And Melissa called me cruel and said I wanted to watch her lose everything, and I said I wanted to watch her tell the truth, and if the truth costs you everything you have, maybe you did not own it in the first place. The next week unfolded like a slow bruise, with scattered calls from my parents that started with instructions and ended with silence. And with Jason sending a short message that said he was sorry and that he understood why I had done what I did even if he wished I had done it differently. And with Melissa posting less and less until the day a link appeared in the group chat for a listing that said for sale by owner, and there it was, the house that had fed so many conversations about achievement now reduced to square footage and features and a price that felt like a verdict, and my mother called to say that families do foolish things under stress, and that I should at least come for Christmas, so we could reset. And I said I would not be resetting anything until the people who set the table admitted who had been footing the bill, and she sighed and changed the subject and I let her, because sometimes the win is not in the applause, it is in keeping the boundary intact. If you are waiting for some cinematic move with paperwork and sheriffs and boxes on the lawn, that is not what happened, because real endings are quieter and more personal, and the last card I played was the one that mattered most to me, which was to send one long message to the family chat that did not include a single accusation or a single curse, just a detailed resignation from the unpaid role I had held for years, listing dates and totals and the exact sentence they used when they uninvited me, and I closed with a line that said I would not be attending any gathering organized by rankings, that my door is open to anyone who wants to talk like equals, and that I wish them all the stability they thought they already had. And then I put my phone down and went on with my life, and the calls kept coming for a while and then they thinned. And then one evening my father sent a message that was 3 lines long saying he had been wrong and that I had carried more than anyone knew and that he was sorry, and I laughed without bitterness and wrote back that apology accepted, and that the new rule was simple: pay for what you praise, praise what you pay for, and keep my name off any lists that measure people by the trophies on their shelves instead of the weight they have carried in the dark. I did not go to Christmas, and I did not send a gift, and I did not explain myself to cousins who wanted a better story, and when Melissa called again and again with a number that changed once the house found a buyer, I let half the calls ring and I picked up a few when I felt strong enough, and I said the same thing each time, which was that I loved her and that I would always answer if she wanted to talk like a grown woman who tells the truth, and that I would never again be her silent sponsor, and that is the ending I gave myself, not a headline or a punishment anyone can print, just the clean knowledge that I walked away from a role that asked me to disappear while paying the lights. And that when they told me I did not belong at a table reserved for high achievers, I quietly removed the chair they did not know I had built, and the sound they heard afterward was not cruelty, it was gravity, and it was overdue, and yes, it was epic.